Uh, Welcome everyone to this session on promoting the breadth of learning opportunities for all students. This is Doug McCall from the International School Health Network and a member of the FRESH Partnership, who I'll be chairing and facilitating the session a little bit. We have two presenters, Esther Kerr, who is a senior fellow from the Global Economy and Development section of the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution, and Martin Henry, who is the research coordinator with Education International. The session description is on the screen in front of you. We're looking at the breadth of learning opportunities and the implications that holds for teaching and learning in the future. And it's connected to the discussions that are ongoing about the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, Target 4.7, and also it spills into discussions such as the one that OECD is having on Education 2030, their Learning Compass initiative. So I'm really pleased to be welcoming both of our presenters today and looking forward to this session. The webinar is part of a series. We're doing this early March over the next 10 days or so prior to the Comparative Education Conference in Miami in March. This recording will be posted on the FRESH website on the webinars and open web meetings page, and you'll be able to access the slides as well as the recording moving forward. So thank you again to our two speakers, and I'm going to ask Esther to begin her presentation with her next slide, which should come up right now. Great, thanks, Esther.
Lovely, thanks, Doug. Good. I'll just say click as we go through, and hello, everybody. So I want to take a little bit of a timeline perspective from where I sit in what I would call the 21st century skills world, and look at what I see as a movement from global dialogues through to increasing national action. And as you can see from the slide, I'm sort of characterizing this as a breadth of skills movement. Click. So on this slide, you can see some information about the global dialogue piece. And so from late last year, last century, 1996, so a little bit out of order on the slide, we had the UNESCO Delors report. And then moving right through, we can see a great deal of activity at sort of global consortia level, where there are concerns about learners in the knowledge society, where we can see dialogue around conceptual frameworks for identifying and defining key competencies. And also, of course, with the UNESCO piece, starting to establish more of a theoretical foundation for the PISA large-scale assessments. In the last dot point here, we have the ATC 21S framework. So ATC 21S was the Assessment and Teaching of 21st Century Skills project, which ran from around 2010 to 2013. And one of the, I guess, most useful outputs of that particular program was what we refer to as the CASAVI model: knowledge, skills, attitudes, values, and ethics. And Binkley and colleagues did some very useful work there. And you can see the sort of four pillars that came out of that work: ways of thinking, of working, tools for working, and ways of living in this world. And you can see actually with that it's not dissimilar to the information that really came out of UNESCO and the Delors report. And when we look at how different countries and different consortia now are looking at frameworks of 21st century skills, often this particular perspective comes out very, very clearly. So if we click on, we can see then that global discussion starting to take place within the Learning Metrics Taskforce. But what was different about this was the diversity of stakeholders. So prior to this, you had OECD, UNESCO, European Society, and so on talking. But within Learning Metrics Taskforce, we had much greater pickup from North America and particularly from South America and Africa. And so a great deal more country voices coming into looking at LMTF. Now, the focus of LMTF, and Martin Henry will talk about this a bit, was more shifting the global agenda from access to education toward the matter of access plus learning, so about quality. It was a multi-stakeholder collaboration. It was led by UNESCO, CIES and Brookings, and it was guided by 3 questions. And those were, what learning is important for all children and youth? Should learning outcomes be measured? And how can measurement actually improve education quality? So they're very, very simple questions, but what they led to was a huge amount of visibility, and also what you see in this image, and the idea of these 7 domains of learning. And this is where we really move into breadth of learning. And so LMTF, we're talking about the 7 domains as being applicable from early childhood through to post-primary schooling, although there was acknowledgement that some domains are more relevant at different learning stages. So I think, in retrospect, that major contribution of LMTF was about consolidating a whole child view of education and raising the awareness, particularly of country stakeholders, of the need for assessment data that could inform their systems. And so from LMTF, that acted as another major platform for movement, CLIC. So what we see on this slide now is a little bit of information about what we refer to as BOLO, breadth of learning opportunities. And again, Martin will talk about this more in detail. And so that 7 domain model from LMTF provided a framework for this particular approach and the BOLO tool. And the tool was designed to help national systems analyse the degree to which these reflected a breadth model, and the degree to which that breadth might be reflected through different layers of an education system. And as you can see on this slide, BOLO adopted that sort of intended, planned and implemented model structure. And I mean, we know that different people identify lots of different layers in terms of this intended, planned and implemented, but this is the one that we used in the BOLO work. And so the intention of the tool was to capture data at each of those layers so that we could triangulate the curricular opportunities as they actually exist in the system. So it's not just about what is intended, it was about checking, hey, has that intention actually translated into planning? Has it translated into implementation in the classroom? And as I said, I'll leave the rest of that for Martin to talk through. But it also, if we click on, led to some work that we did at Brookings. And in that work, on the visualising the breadth of skills movement slide, we did some very, I guess in one sense, some slight work where we gathered information about over 160 national education systems. So based on what was available on websites, we identified what the aspirations of education systems were and looked for the degree to which we could see 21st century skills embedded in those national education systems. So it wasn't exactly the breadth of learning that we see in the LMTF framework, where we were talking much more about different subject and discipline areas as well. This was just specific to looking for, can we find things like problem solving, critical thinking, communication, and so on. And this particular mapping project really provided pretty solid evidence that we were seeing a shift in national educational aspirations worldwide. And you can see there the URL skills.brookings.edu, and you can go to that at any time. And if you scroll through that particular page, you'll find this map comes up, and you can also interrogate the map. And so really what we were looking at is, first of all, are there mission and vision statements that talk about the skills? Then if we look into curricular documents, can we find the skills embedded through those as well? And then right at the far end, can we find that there's some evidence of conceptualization of growth within skills or competencies? And of course, once you get down to that level, you've got really pretty concrete evidence that something is happening at that curricular level. One of the things, of course, is that from this sort of study, though, you can't see what is actually happening in the classroom. And that's been one of the big issues throughout. So click, and we will see on this slide one of the issues for us, which is what are the gaps between these conceptual models? So on the one, we've got the intended, achieved, implemented sort of model. On the other, we've got this other issue that particularly came out in that mapping study, which is that we might see something appearing aspirationally, we might see it appearing at curricular level, but that still doesn't mean that we're going to see it being taught in the classroom. It still doesn't mean that we can see it being assessed, reported, and used. So this was the beginning of really looking at gaps. And if we click on, this study was also undertaken about the same time as the mapping study, which initially was in 2016. And here we looked at 4 countries in more detail. And I'm aware, of course, that this slide has got too much information on it, but the report is readily available up on the Brookings website. And here we were looking at Mexico, South Africa, Kenya, and the Philippines. And we were interested here in the degree to which the different stakeholder groups in each of those countries valued different aspects of education. And I've just put up the 21st century skills aspect of this here, but there are also other groups of human capabilities such as and characteristics such as attitudes and values and so on. And what was really interesting about this is the difference between those stakeholder groups, between the parents and teachers right through to the government personnel. But what we could see pretty clearly was that a lot of these added aspects of educational opportunity were definitely highly valued by the different stakeholder groups. So there might have been some differences in prioritization of them, but there's no doubt that the majority of the stakeholders were looking for something beyond traditional academic disciplines. So a nice, useful little piece of more qualitative information that backed us up. And then if we look at the last, click onto the last initiative that I will look at in terms of the past, we can see this work here from UNICEF in the Philippines. And this happened last year, 2019. And this work was very, very useful to us because we're starting to look at really funneling down much more. The Philippines has done a great deal of work on 21st century skills. They have a framework they've adopted, and in principle, they have integrated it into the curriculum. And what we did in this project was really do an audit of the curriculum itself to look for, I think, 3 major 21st century skills. And you can see sort of here on the slide a little bit of how there was coding going on. So getting really into the nitty-gritty. And so identifying where it was intended that a wider sort of breadth of learning was anticipated, and then taking that information and information about what the skills might look like in the classroom, and then going and doing classroom observations throughout the Philippines in 3 different regions to see what was actually happening. And I guess as we might expect, not as much was happening as people had anticipated. So it was a very nice demonstration of the fact that even when a country is very serious about it at a curricular level, it doesn't mean it's happening in the classroom. That might sort of seem self-evident, and many of us might think that's going to happen anyway, but it's very nice to have the evidence and know that that is the situation. So if we click on, there's a summary of these sort of 4 studies and pieces of information. Martin Henry will talk about these gaps between aspiration and practice from the Breadth of Learning Opportunities tool. Then we have the Brookings findings from large-scale mapping. We know there's an education shift that is more holistic. We can look at perspectives from different stakeholders in countries and see there are some differences, but also a lot of commonality. And then we can see that there are huge gaps in curriculum versus observations. So this takes us to where we are now. And if we click on to 2020 plus, I'll talk briefly about these 2 things. Now, the first graphic you'll be very much aware of with the Sustainable Development Goals. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some work that is happening there. And then just launched last week, we have the IEA 21 CIES map study, or 21st Century Skills Mapping study, that is just starting up. So on the next slide, we can see the Global Alliance for Monitoring Learning. And this alliance, often referred to as GAML, is a network that's coordinated by UNESCO Institute of Statistics to help with the process of identification of indicators for SDG, for the education goal. And it has a wide group of stakeholders, but of particular interest in this breadth of learning context is, as we can see on this next slide, click, we're interested here in 4.7, target 4.7. And this is the one around sustainable development, around education for sustainable development, human rights, gender equality, and so on. And if you think about this particular goal and think about the competencies that are needed in order to promote these aims, we come back to 21st century skills. We need people who can solve problems and who can think critically, who can communicate, and so on. So if we go sort of down a level from 4.7, we can see that this breadth notion is absolutely intrinsic to the goals that are identified by 4.7. And so I've been leading a working group recently, which has been on a breadth indicator. And it very much follows the model, really, of the breadth of learning opportunity tool. And so this working group under the aegis of UIS is conceptualizing and identifying a measurement approach for an additional thematic indicator for 4.7. And so, again, very much like the BOLO tool or even the 21 CIES map project that I'll talk about in a moment, is that we're not looking at student assessment outcomes. We're looking at what are the opportunities for students to be exposed to a greater breadth of learning. And this particular working group should finish its initial conceptualization and concept papers within the next 2 to 3 months. Then click on to this slide, and we have the recently released IEA study, for which I'm the study director. And this study is set up so that we get information from the countries to identify exactly what is happening at their curricular levels. So rather than going across websites and looking and having people who are external to countries trying to pick up information and therefore maybe not always picking up accurate information, 21 CIES map is like most IEA studies where country representatives are the ones who provide the information. And so the idea of this study is that we'll get a much better map of what is happening in curriculum worldwide, or at least among those countries that are going to participate in this particular study. The thing is that we need to understand what is happening in this field of breadth of learning or 21st century skills across different countries so that we can identify what is common. And when we can identify what is common, that helps us to identify what is reasonable to expect in the longer term. So if we think about subjects like history or maths or language, we have a reasonably well-developed understanding of what that means in terms of curriculum and therefore in terms of student performance. We don't have that same sort of information in some of these areas that breadth of learning covers. And so 21 CIES map will help us to identify precisely that. So that really takes us through to where we are today at the beginning of 2020. And I'll click on to the next slide, and thanks for your attention, and I hope that you found this very useful.
Thank you very much, Esther. Martin, before you begin your presentation, any add-on comments for Esther's overview of that evolution? It's very interesting, very powerful.
Well, I think Esther set us up with quite a large set of frameworks, information, and questions, and I'll be looking in the next presentation at how those questions work in terms of the relationship between teachers, government, and curricula.
Okay, and there's, sorry, just to note for folks, there's Esther's contact information, and we'll go to the start of Martin's presentation. Martin, please jump in. Okay,
so I'm pressing the take over button, which hopefully means that I can click as I go. If we get any hiccups on this, we'll see. Breadth of learning was a process that Esther's already described how things sort of came about in terms of what was set up there. And there were a whole lot of relationships between the different parts. So the Learning Metrics Taskforce came up with the framework that was described, and we got involved in looking at particular examples in Kenya with secondary teachers and in Zambia with primary school teachers, and we designed a survey instrument that was looking across each of the Learning Metric Task Force areas at what was actually happening in the classroom as opposed to what was mandated in the curriculum. And you will see there a link to an article which I think you've already shared, Doug, with everybody, which was written by Seamus Hegarty, Kate Anderson, Esther Kerr, who's just spoken to us, Kim and me, and we looked there, Helen Kim that is, and we looked there at the ways in which the different elements wrapped over each other. In terms of what we experienced using the tool and then unraveling the tool, was that there were a number of situations in which a good example is ICT. ICT, or information and communications technology, would be seen as a critical plank to curricula in a country, yet there weren't any computers in the classrooms for people to use. Now, if that's the situation, you can't teach it on the blackboard. So there's a whole lot of questions around the way that curriculum meets. And I think Esther very diplomatically touched on a number of these questions about how a curriculum framework in a national setting might have aspirations that are quite similar across a lot of the world, but miss out on some of the crucial elements. And to just hook into the fresh partnership there, Doug, that there are a number of ways in which life skills, health, and some of the elements of what happens within the physical education area are given lip service, if you like, in the curricula, but are not being played out in the classroom. We've also done some work in Africa with a set of 3 meetings that we've partnered with OSF, which is the Open Societies Foundation, and we work with the African Union on the 2nd meeting as well as with UNESCO and UNICEF and others. And that's been looking at the relationship between curriculum, professional learning, teachers' perspectives, and what's happening in the classroom. And of course, we at Education International represent teachers' unions and are a global union federation representing about 32 million teachers, but teachers don't exist without students. So we haven't been working in those meetings on any question that's not related to the realities that a student experiences in the classroom every day. And we've been lucky enough in that work to work with Yusuf Saeed, who put together a superb report for us, where it actually went through and talked to government officials, union officials, and looked at the documents available in countries and how they related the one to the other. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit now. Now, if we look at the SDG education targets, Esther's referred to 4.7, but all of the targets have many things within them that we need to consider. And the consideration of the whole breadth of the targets around SDG 4 as central to the way that we've approached the work, that you can't take out one element without thinking about another. And I have to say that the education sector has not been nimble enough in comparing SDG 4 to the other SDG targets either. And Yusuf brought up some of the points that are within this. 4.7, which does bring up the idea of peace, non-violence, global citizenship, etc., and sustainable development that Esther's already referred to, is one that we're going to look at in a bit more depth as well. And I also want to point out 4C, which is where the supply of qualified teachers and the frameworks around teacher training in countries needs to be much better organized and better thought through. And we've worked there with UNESCO on a professional standards framework, which is a joint framework that we've looked at setting up a way of thinking about teacher professionalism that will give us a shape within the classroom. Now, in terms of where we go with our responses, it's all too easy, and I lift this from the UNESCO Global Education Monitoring Report 2017, to blame the teachers. And we find that that approach is kicked around in many fora around some of the frameworks we've talked about. And it's something that comes up at OECD, it comes up at the meetings in Africa, it comes up in many settings around what you do about the results. And I think Esther rightly pointed out that you can't just look at a cold set of results and say, well, that's the answer, because it isn't. There are a whole lot of environmental and ecological factors that feed into what's going on. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about that. If we look at pedagogy, we're aware that pedagogy is the whole connection of what goes on between the teacher and the student. So we've done quite a bit of work here at looking at what the act of teaching is and how the act of teaching and the culture of teaching operates within a structure. So what are the mechanisms of control that exist around pedagogy and around teaching that allow or not the ability for students to learn and to have the breadth of opportunities we're after in place? And this framework here was developed by Yusuf, but it looks at the way that the teacher and the student, and quality teaching, Esther mentioned earlier on, we're looking at a way in which quality teaching is developed within the context of the other factors which are brought into play. So the way in which the cultural context, the social context, the economic context, and the political context comes to bear on teacher policy, how that works through professional development and other forms, and how it impacts and works within the classroom area. Because if we're not reaching into the classroom to the teacher and the student and the relationship that's at the heart of education, we're not able to shape or show proper response to the discourse that we're talking about. And if we're going to think about the opportunities to learn that happen within the broader area of health and life skills and the Safe Schools network that you're working on, Doug, there are a whole lot of ways in which those connections need to be deliberate and need to be made in a thought through and thorough manner. 10 countries were looked at in this piece of work. So we looked, the first group there is Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire and Madagascar. And there are a whole lot of ways in which things were happening that were able to allow learning to happen up to a point, but there were limitations on that. And there was another group of teachers, which was Kenya, Malawi, South Africa, Uganda, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. And interestingly, we've had both Zambia and Kenya who were in the breadth of learning work involved in this as well. And a number of ways in which the interaction between the factors of policy formation and curriculum formation were not able to see delivery on the ground. Mozambique, you'll see, comes through in the next couple of slides as quite specific. So we were working here Anglophone, Lusophone, and Francophone, and there are some quite specific ways in which the different language groups fit together as well. In terms of curriculum and the way that curriculum happens, you will see that there's a competency-based teaching approach within the first group, Burkina Faso, Côte d'Ivoire, and Madagascar, whereas in the second group, we've got 21st century knowledge, skills, and attitudes, which has come from some of the frameworks Esther's already talked about. Lifelong learning is becoming more and more of a plank in what's happening in teacher policy and curricula, although the follow-through on how that's being delivered within countries that we're working with needs a lot of follow-up if we're going to get to any alignment around SDG 4. Mozambique has a teacher education curriculum that focuses on competency standards, inclusive. There's a whole strand on inclusive education there, which is interesting. And there's a whole way in which local curriculum is seen to influence national curriculum. And I'm going to talk a bit about that, a bit more about that in a minute. Cross-cutting themes are transversal there, which many curricula are coming to that sort of way of thinking now. And if you take the OECD 2030 framework, that work on transversal competencies, which is not a new term, it did come out of that DESECO process and has been talked about for a number of years, quarter of a century, 20 years and more, that has been developing, is certainly starting to weave its way through. How you actually then construct a transversal response in a way which both responds to initial teacher education and the need for professional learning and development is a bigger question, and one that many countries are wrestling with, and not just the countries I'm talking about here. Teacher professional development works differently within the structures as well. And one thing that I do want to talk about in terms of professional learning and development that works is that we've discovered through this research that the cascade model is absolutely not the way to go. And this will be no surprise to you, Doug, or you, Esther, but it's something that we need to be really clear about in terms of our deliberate interaction with teachers in the classroom, that there are models where there is a more thoughtful approach that is happening in a number of countries, and that we need to think about how that can be spread more clearly. Formal structures and commitment to social dialogue. Well, what we discovered about curriculum, and we were working with senior government officials and general secretaries, so we were having conversations across country teams where there was a dialogue between government and the teaching workforce. And it's really clear from that conversation and how it flows that if you're going to have local curriculum, then you've got to be specific about local expertise, and you've got to transform local knowledge into a local curriculum as well. So this was an interviewee from Mozambique said it's actually written there, but it's not practical for it to happen as such. It's not that nothing has happened, but to happen at that level, to have local curricula influenced in settings all around a country is not necessarily going to happen just because it's written in curricula. 21st century skills and how they interact with the SDG 4 is something that we're all thinking about, and there's got to be a more deliberate way in which that conversation is brought to life within the people who are the guardians of teacher policy. So the way in which that discussion flows backwards and forwards. And I think that the evidence that Esther's talked about and how countries work with evidence is really, really important. And that way of working with evidence has to happen in a way that puts the teachers and the people designing the policy to implement in the same room, working together on the implementation strategy. Because where that's happened, you've got a better chance of success. And there are a number of examples that we looked at. There was one at South Africa that we looked at in our first year's meeting in Soweto, where PLD was being supported over a period of time with teachers and academics and people working with them in order to consider the way that the curriculum was impacting on students, was continually supported. And I think those models of continual support, there's one in New Zealand called Te Ko Taitanga, which looked at Māori perspectives and used Māori perspectives with teaching teachers and students to work in a different way around cultural reflexiveness and cultural responsiveness. Those ways of working with teachers which actually shift their understanding in a supportive way are the ones that we think make a bigger difference. We also looked at some of the gaps, which Esther's also referred to. And there are gaps and silences, really, in the way that curricula and things are operating together. And Yusuf's rightly pointed out some here, which I think map over with the other work that's going on. So environmental education is seriously underdone. And if we look at the way that the planet is responding to that and our young people, we're at a point where we just can't sit back anymore and just allow that situation to continue. I think peace and conflict reconciliation came up as an area where we need more support and more focus and more clarity from both curricula and teacher support mechanisms to make change happen. We also looked at skills for life and skills for relevant economic growth. We have been doing some work with Gavin Moody and Lisa Wheelahan around productive capabilities. And I know the ILO Future of Work Commission came out with a piece of work around human capabilities as well. And we agree that that framing around capabilities that Esther's already mentioned is actually really important for expanding our understanding of the student, so that we're not seeing student just as linked to skills, but more broadly in the terms of an individual who has capabilities throughout their life that need to be grown. And highlighting areas of citizenship and others are coming up in other pieces of work, such as the 2030 Learning Framework at OECD. Teacher need is development and not regulation. I can't emphasize this enough, that if you take a monitoring approach, and there's countries in Europe who do this quite strongly, who will remain nameless, but if you take a monitoring approach that is driven by what you see and responding to what you see, you end up with the ruler measurement response. And it can be very undermining of both teacher professionalism and student learning. And I think there are a whole lot of ways in which we need to be more deliberate about that conversation and need to be clearer about the ways in which teacher learning can be supported and responded to in a way which is growing their ability to be autonomous professionals in the classroom, making the right decisions. And if we go back to the Mozambique slide, that's where you're able to discuss then in a way which gives you the authority and the ability to do so, a way of interacting with local curriculum, so that you can weave the local into what's been given and passed around on a national level. If we think about PD models and the sort of models that we need for curricular change, I've already raised this issue about the cascade model, but I think Yusuf's put it particularly clearly here, that the last person to be trained has got only half of the training. So in other words, the information which goes to the first teacher does not get to the last teacher. And that came from one of the Malawi interviews. But you see there that it's a model which has been favored by NGOs for a long time. And it's one that many countries within the OECD setting have moved away from. And it's something that we should all be thinking about in terms of how we structure the education financing in a way that supports systemically rather than works on individual projects or programs. And I'll be interested in your views on that at the end, both Doug and Esther, actually. So in terms of what it's all about, implementation, and I love this phrase, curriculum should not arrive like thunder. And we find that in many African countries, this has been the experience. So we've had a rewriting of curricula where new strands have come in or new elements have been put into the curricula, such as elements of 21st century skills. All of a sudden, teachers are expected to teach critical thinking when they haven't been given any support or training or resources or ways of unraveling what critical thinking is. And it's that example of curriculum just arriving like thunder. It should never be that way. That there's got to be a way in which curricula is developed through processes which involve the whole profession, so that you can take all of the schools and all of the teachers with you as you go through it. It's not an undoable task, but it's one that takes deliberate and thoughtful approaches. And we know a lot about the way that those work. And I have to say, the maturity with which people were talking about these issues across the meetings we've had were really encouraging, because the paper and information and evidence by itself won't move practice. What moves practice is what you do around it. Teacher well-being, I've added this slide because I think it's impossible to think about how we move the system, and I think this relates strongly to student well-being, and we've talked about this in the Fresh Fora before, that the relationship between the two is symbiotic, if you like, that the well-being of the school is about teachers and students having their well-being looked after, and that if they are, then they're able to develop learners that are all economically productive and critical citizens. That whole way in which you develop growth and social transformation is an organic one, and it's one that has to take all the participants within the education sector through together. It's not one where you can separate one part from the other and have the sort of graphs that we were looking at before, where what one group of people experience as happening is so different to what another experience. There should be alignment across, and there should be an understanding of how the well-being of all the people, all the actors in the system, if you like, are working together. I've got some links here to the reports that were written by our colleagues in Kenya and in Zambia. And what we discovered as a result of that is some very serious work going on in the Kenyan setting around those high schools, and the conversations that were going on between the heads of department and the young teachers, and the way that people were thinking about it was really thoughtful. Implementation of curriculum needs to follow that same model. And in the Zambian case, we did see some big gaps between what was in the curricula and what was being followed through. But I have to say that the way in which the Zambians have been working on overcoming those gaps and working together across the system to work out some better ways of implementing have been really encouraging. And we'd like to see more cross-country cooperation so that there's more support being given from one neighbour to the next around the things that have been successful and the things that need to be developed further. And I'll talk here about the Democratic Republic of Congo, where there was study circles work going on, where there was support happening within areas of the country where it was able to support it, that were really encouraging around the life skills area. And there's just some acknowledgements here. I think it's good to acknowledge the people that I work with at KNUT and ZNUT, and that's my details. I think it's probably a place to stop, Doug, because there may be questions or reflections across the three of us on how the bits fit together. You're on mute, dog. I'm expecting some.
Hi, Martin. Just while we're waiting for Doug to come back online, perhaps I could make a couple of comments.
Yeah, sure.
So there are lots of things there that I'd like to pick up on, but I'll just pick up on three. I absolutely agree about the issue of the cascade model not working very well. And you can see in some countries that they are setting up alternative strategies. And typically these tend to be through professional learning teams or learning action cells or professional learning communities, whatever you might like to call them. And one of the issues, however, with that is how do schools or networks of schools actually implement those sorts of communities in a way that brings in new knowledge as opposed to just being a reiteration of what is already known. So I think that there are some issues around that. I mean, I'm not an expert in that field at all. I did some work in the first decade of this country around professional learning teams, but it'd be nice to see if there's some useful research coming out about how we can make sure that those are a little bit more effective than they were, at least at the beginning of this century. The next one issue for me was around the point that you raised on localization and contextualization. And I'm ashamed to admit it, but the issue around curriculum versus text is not really something that ever came up on my sort of view until in the last year or so. And I've looked at and been a little bit involved with a group called NISM, and that's nism.org, NISSEM. And they are a community of practitioners, educators, and academics. And they are a network that has been set up to try to integrate SDG Target 4.7 together with social emotional learning skills into educational materials. And so they've recently put together a stack of briefs that talk a lot about this issue that you've raised on contextualization of texts. And from what I've seen with my work in countries, we have a little bit of a tension between, in some countries, the curriculum is the curriculum. In other countries, the curriculum are actually the texts that are used. And where that's the case, of course, those texts can really severely inhibit teaching. And it takes away sort of the autonomy often for teachers being enabled to take the responsibility and the leadership over their work. And so I think that's a fascinating area for us to learn more about. And then the final point, the one you made about cooperation between countries, though I can't agree more that we're seeing a lot of countries making big changes and small changes, and they can only benefit if they work together. And in the work that I've been involved in for the last couple of years, that's called Optimising Assessment for All, or OAA, we've been working precisely in that manner where we work with a group of countries. And for Africa in particular, we've been working with DR Congo, the Gambia and Zambia, and Kenya in the first instance as well. And they've all worked together collaboratively to develop assessments. And we've been doing the same in Asia with Cambodia and Nepal and Mongolia. And that mode of working, of having experts and educators from each country working together, you can see the building of knowledge, and obviously that leads to the knowledge that I accumulate because it comes from them, and so it's absolutely magic. So if we could find some ways of getting actual implementation, development work happening between countries to a greater extent, I think we'd be looking really, really good. So fascinating points you've been raising there.
Yeah, I agree, Esther. And we've started on this work, but we are looking to collaborate further with UNESCO to keep moving this forward via the Teacher Taskforce. But I know there's a lot of bits of work going on. There's the work that you're doing. There's work going on through the indicator process. I'm keen to keep that connected to what's happening in country. And I think that we've been able to turn up some evidence here, and I think there are cooperative groups. So UNESCO have a group in the southern African region where they're actually all work pretty well together down there, and there's a number of comparisons going on. The one thing I think we need to try and avoid is developing too many frameworks and not having enough support on the ground. But that's an old problem, and one that I don't think is going to go away soon. But I think, like you find with the Cambodia cluster, that there's a whole lot of ways in which teachers talking across the divide are able to reflect upon their own country realities and work out some ways of going about it a bit differently. But I think it's been fascinating to see where you're up to and for you to see where I'm up to, and we're still sort of clearly doing quite a lot of stuff.
Just to jump in and to thank you both for this conversation. That's one of the joys of being semi-retired and working through a group like Fresh, is the amazing amount of good ideas and good people that I certainly am running into and learning a lot from each and every day. I don't want to stop our conversation, but at the same time, I'm going to try to connect this discussion and this recording to the other recordings that are going on prior to the CIES conference, and I'm really pleased to see the connections, and I think they'll come out as I make a couple of comments, and I guess the first one is just in response to the curriculum as thunder analogy. I've always seen the curriculum as kind of a very slow-moving train, or maybe even a very slow walk, and people are often surprised to see that curriculum documents are most often 10 or 12 years old, and that's because curriculum changes very slowly, or at least official curriculum documents describing subject outcomes, because the school systems operate on 10 or 12 year timeframes. And that's very different for the folks that I work with in the health sector, who are very used to working in a 2 or 3 year project kind of basis, and you put together materials on an issue and you put some research together and then you pump it out at schools and then you move on to another issue. And so it's really important that we take a kind of a systems approach to that. And I'm pleased to note that one of the presentations in Miami will be on systems change and the fresh conversations that we've been having on what we've called cross-cutting themes, where we look at long-term implementation, and here's another word, maintenance issues, and sustainability issues, and scaling up issues, and how we get things to be mainstreamed in education systems when they have just a terribly overcrowded agenda. And so there's a conversation that Fresh is sponsoring, and a document that they're putting together of looking at how we can start to look concretely what kinds of things that can be happening to really build capacity and build systems change gradually, incrementally. And so that really is I think an important part of the conversation, and will be one of the presentations and one of the recordings that people will have access to on the same page as this one will be. The second one is looking at context, and it's come out as well. There's been some really good work done by Save the Children, another partner in Fresh, with really a programmatic perspective, but they've gone through probably at least 25 different webinars on specific programs, and there's lots of lessons that have been learned about those programs that can be generalized to the context of low-resource countries. And we've been fortunate as well getting a little bit of funding through Plan International in the UK to be able to put that together into a bit of an understanding about the context of low-resource countries. And one of the outcomes, one of the suggestions in the consensus paper that we put together is that there needs to be more structured opportunities for countries with similar circumstances working on similar issues and have a chance to work together and to learn from each other the way we've talked about in this webinar. And so that's another presentation that's going to be led by Save the Children folks, and is a way of there's been a really good discussion like that led by a group called the Interagency Network on Emergencies in Education. they've been able to pull together knowledge around that context. And I'm hoping that fresh partners will be able to really accumulate them. Well, they are already accumulating knowledge about low resource countries that could lead into ongoing exchanges between countries in that context. A third presentation that is going to be in Miami, and is also it's actually the recording will be done this Thursday, and it's looking at another working group within FRESH on health and life skills education. And there's connections that we've seen throughout these remarks, but we've kind of put together a very broad look at that health and life skills education, because we think it's important to have that as a part of the core curriculum or subject offerings in schools. We're trying to find different ways of organizing that can be considered by the countries. And then also, and this is the revolutionary part, that we're actually trying to start with the notion that there's only a limited amount of instructional time or a time outside of the classroom that can be devoted to that part of health and life skills learning. And we're trying to start with the notion that let's look at how much time is available and what can actually be done, and try to build menus and models for countries to use to be able to decide what they want to focus in on, because health and life skills is a very broad area, and so they need to focus on their resources on the issues and challenges to their young people that are most relevant to them. And then the other session, and it'll be led by UNICEF. They've been able to find funding to be able to start us out on a data collection process that sounds, Esther, very much like like the work done by the Learning Metrics Taskforce, by looking at the documents, and there's going to be a survey done of ministry officials, and then a huge collection of documents, be they curriculum documents, policy documents, or guidance documents on various numbers of paradigms and models. And that collection of documents will be housed at UNESCO for researchers to look at and to do deeper dives into. But we're hoping that the basic facts that this UNICEF-sponsored survey will give us a kind of a look at the capacities and the time and the services that are available, so that we'll be able to work from some facts rather than just simply a number of models or frameworks that are very aspirational and cannot really get the rubber to meet the road. So that's kind of the 3 or 4 sessions that you'll be hearing more about when you go to Miami, and then also we'll have recordings on here. And I'm really pleased that the ground you covered in these remarks you've given. I'm hoping participants who are able to access this recording and see these slides and the related documents are going to be as amazed as I am by the depth and complexity of what we're looking at here. So again, to both of you, thank you very, very much for your contribution today, and look forward to further conversations.
Thanks, Doug, and thanks, Esther. I'm hoping we three will meet again in Miami.
Sounds good. Thank you both very much.
Okay, thank you, and have a good day. And Martin, you get to bed now.
Yeah, that's it. Cheers, Doug. See you, Esther.
Thank you.